Hi everyone, and welcome to Dr. D's 5-minute lecture series number 4, Thomas Aquinas' third and fourth cosmological arguments to prove God's existence. Alright, so setting the timer, here we go. Now, in its most basic form, Thomas Aquinas argues in his third way that premise number 1, some contingent beings exist. Premise number 2, if any contingent beings exist, then a necessary being exists. And conclusion 3, therefore a necessary being exists. Now obviously, if we're to make any sense of this, we need to understand what a contingent being is and what a necessary being exists. And we also need to understand whether this is a valid argument. So in terms of formal logic, what we see is that we have if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. So in that sense, deductively, this is a valid argument, which means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. A very famous example of such a deductive valid argument would be something like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So the question then becomes, are the premises valid? Well, what does Aquinas mean when he talks about contingent beings? Basically, for Aquinas, a contingent being is a being that's existence depends on other things. So when we look at our world, when we look at the cosmos that we're in, we see that pretty much everything that we can be aware of is contingent in some way or another. So, for example, if my mother hadn't said yes to my father when he asked her out for their first date, I wouldn't be here. Likewise, the room that I'm in, the building that I'm in, if it weren't constructed by workers and funded and maintained, would not exist. In the same way, planet Earth would not exist if the sun hadn't formed, and the sun wouldn't exist if the Milky Way wasn't formed, etc., etc. So pretty much everything that we see in the world we can consider to be contingent. Now, one of the characteristics of contingent things is that at a certain point they did not exist, and that at a future point they will also cease to exist. So the argument that Aquinas basically wants to make is, if this were the case, then at some time or other nothing would have existed. No contingent beings would have existed. And if that were true, then the world would have never come to be. Why? Because something cannot come from nothing. Therefore, there must be at least one thing that is necessary, one necessary being in order to sort of kickstart the world of contingency. And that necessary being, Aquinas will argue, is God. Now, it's very important to understand, in order for this argument to work, that the main characteristic of a necessary being is that it is not dependent on its existence for anything else. So it is just eternal, unchanging, and inherently just as it is. It must be in order for other things to be. So now moving quickly to Aquinas' fourth way, here we see a different tact. So for premise number 1, Aquinas states objects have properties to greater or lesser extents. Premise 2, if an object has a property to a lesser extent, then there exists some other object that has that property to the maximum possible degree. And this he refers to as a maximum exemplar. Therefore, number 3, there is an entity that has all properties to the maximum possible degree. And this entity then, of course, for Aquinas will be God. Now this proof is really based on the Aristotelian idea that properties have maximum exemplars. So fire is the maximum exemplar of heat, and say likewise there would be a maximum exemplar of goodness, of wisdom, of power, and my time is up. And this being Aquinas will want to argue is in fact God. Probably for modern people, Aquinas' fourth argument is least convincing, but nevertheless, there you go. So, as promised, that was Aquinas' third and fourth ways, both cosmological arguments attempting to prove God's existence. So until next time, this is Dr. D signing off.